just 18, abandoned, starving, and pregnant. The father of her child denied her, the village shunned her, and her own family turned their backs. Alone and broken, she fought against hunger, pain, and heartbreak. But she made a vow: her child would have the love she never knew. This is a story of suffering, survival, and an unbreakable spirit. What happens when the world turns its back on you? When the man who once swore to love you abandons you? When hunger and rejection become your only companions? This is the heartbreaking journey of a girl who was left with nothing, except the tiny heartbeat inside her. But even in darkness, she found light. Stay with me as we unfold a tale of sorrow, strength, and ultimate triumph. Abandoned hope. She was just 18 years old, carrying the weight of a child she never planned for, a child whose father had already walked away. The man who had whispered love and devotion into her ears had now disappeared, leaving her to face the scorn of the village alone. Her own mother, filled with shame, turned her back on her, refusing to acknowledge her pain. The whispers of the neighbors were daggers to her fragile heart, slicing through whatever hope she had left. Hunger gnawed at her insides, but the pain of rejection was far worse. With each passing day, the life inside her belly became her only companion, the only source of love she had ever known. The cost of survival. She woke up to an empty stomach and an aching back, her frail body barely able to carry her unborn child. Each step she took was a reminder of the life she was about to bring into a world that had already forsaken her. She knocked on doors, begging for work, but the pity in their eyes was worse than outright rejection. When no one offered her a task, she turned to the only way she knew to earn money: washing clothes for strangers. Some paid her with stale bread, others with cruel laughter, and on the days when washing clothes wasn't enough, desperation led her back to the man who had abandoned her. He paid her not out of kindness, but out of lust, using her weakness against her. She hated him, yet her heart refused to let go. A mother's strength. Her belly grew larger, her body weaker, and the pain never ceased. The child inside her was the only thing keeping her alive, the only one who had never rejected her. She spoke to her baby in hushed whispers, rubbing her swollen stomach, finding solace in the little kicks that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. But the village's scorn only grew harsher. The other girls, once her friends, now mocked her, their laughter echoing in her ears like a cruel melody. She dreamt of the day she would finally give birth, of the moment she could hold her child and promise them the love she had never known. Until then, she endured, because she had no choice. A crippling betrayal. The man who had abandoned her now paraded new lovers in front of her home, each woman more beautiful than the last. They laughed at her, called her names, mocked the way her body had changed with pregnancy. She tried to look away, but the pain in her chest was unbearable. She had given him everything, and in return, he had given her nothing but heartbreak. And yet, her heart refused to hate him. She longed for his touch, for the warmth she had once believed was love. But love had never been real, it had been an illusion, a cruel trick played by fate. The breaking point nights were the hardest. She lay awake, clutching her belly, praying for strength she no longer had. The hunger, the exhaustion, the loneliness, they were consuming her, threatening to break whatever was left of her spirit. She had no one to turn to, no place to go. She thought of ending it all, of giving up. But every time she considered it, the baby inside her kicked as if reminding her to keep fighting. And so, she held on. Because she had to. Because she owed it to the little life that had become her everything. Desperation. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her body was too weak to stand, and her vision blurred as she sat outside her home, hoping for kindness from a stranger. But kindness was a luxury she had never known. Her hands trembled as she reached out to beg, but no one looked her way. Desperate, she knocked on her aunt's door, the one person she believed would help her. But her aunt turned her away without a second glance. The rejection burned, a deep ache that no amount of tears could soothe. And so, she walked away, knowing she truly had no one left. The final stretch. As the months passed, the pain in her body became a relentless torment. The weight of her unborn child stole what little strength she had left. Every night, she prayed to survive, for the baby to be born healthy, despite the suffering she endured. She barely recognized herself anymore, a girl turned into a shadow, a soul stretched too thin. Her belly was tight, her limbs swollen, and the loneliness pressed down on her like an unshakable force. She whispered to her child, promising love, promising a better life. It was the only promise she could still make. Labor pains. The night was dark when the pain started. A sharp, unrelenting agony tore through her, bringing her to her knees. She had no one to call, no one to help her. She dragged herself to the only place she knew, the nearby forest, where she could hide from the cruel eyes of the village. Alone, in the dirt, she screamed as life tore through her fragile body. The stars above bore witness to her suffering, but no one else did. And in that moment, she realized, she was truly alone. Fear gripped her chest, a reminder that she was alone in this battle. There was no mother to guide her, no father to protect her, no family to hold her hand. She clutched her belly, her breath ragged, tears mixing with sweat as pain racked her body. The agony of childbirth had begun, but there was no one there to witness her suffering, no one to remind her that she was strong enough to survive. The first cry hours later, as dawn broke, the cries of a newborn filled the cold air. She held her child close, tears falling freely down her cheeks. Despite everything, despite the pain and rejection, she had created something beautiful. A tiny, fragile life that belonged to her and her alone. And as she looked into her baby's eyes, she made a vow, she would give them the love she never had. No matter what it took. The first night with her baby was the longest of her life. The child wailed in the cold, their tiny body shivering against her bare chest. She had nothing, no blanket, no food, no warm place to rest. She wrapped the baby in the torn fabric of her old dress, rocking them against her weak body, whispering soft apologies between sobs. She was a mother now, but how could she care for a child when she could barely care for herself? Hunger gnawed at her stomach, exhaustion blurred her vision, but she refused to sleep. She was all the baby had. If she failed now, who would love them? Morning came, and with it, the cruel reality of her situation. She walked through the village with the baby clutched to her chest, her legs barely able to carry her. The women she once called neighbors turned their heads, whispering as she passed. Some laughed, others sneered. A group of men shook their heads, murmuring about how she had ruined her own life. She was too loose, they said. What did she expect? But she didn't expect this world where kindness was a myth, where her child's first days were filled with hunger and cold. Desperation clawed at her throat. She needed food, she needed shelter. She needed help. But no one cared. Morning came, and with it, the cruel reality of her situation. She walked through the village with the baby clutched to her chest, her legs barely able to carry her. The women she once called neighbors turned their heads, whispering as she passed. Some laughed, others sneered. A group of men shook their heads, murmuring about how she had ruined her own life. She was too loose, they said. What did she expect? But she didn't expect this world where kindness was a myth, where her child's first days were filled with hunger and cold. Desperation clawed at her throat. She needed food, she needed shelter. She needed help. But no one cared. The village women watched in silence as she knelt beside the river, her fingers raw and trembling in the cold water. She washed their clothes, her back aching, her baby crying in the shade. They paid her with scraps, moldy bread, half-eaten yams. She swallowed her pride and ate, knowing she needed strength to feed her child. But the whispers never stopped. The laughter behind her back, the pitying glances, it was as if she had ceased to be human, reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. Still, she endured. She worked, she starved, she survived. Because her child deserved more than this cruelty. One evening, as she sat under the old baobab tree, feeding her child with what little milk she had left, she saw him. The father of her baby. He strolled through the village with another woman on his arm, his laughter ringing out in the air. Her breath hitched, her chest tightening with pain she had thought was long buried. He saw her. He looked at her as though she were nothing, as though she were a mistake he had already forgotten. And then, without hesitation, he walked past her. The woman beside him sneered, whispering something in his ear that made him smirk. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He had left her. He had abandoned their child. And yet, a foolish part of her had still hoped he would care. Days later, she sat in the marketplace, exhausted, her baby too weak to cry. She had given them the last bit of food she had, and now there was nothing left. Her vision blurred, her body swayed, and then, darkness. When she woke, she was in a small hut, wrapped in a thin blanket, her baby resting beside her. A woman sat nearby, stirring a pot over a fire. "Eat," she said, handing her a wooden bowl. The young mother hesitated, but hunger won. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she ate, her first real meal in days. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. The woman's eyes softened. "Because once, I was you." The woman's name was Mama Jolly, and she knew the pain of a woman cast aside. She let the young mother stay, gave her a roof, food, and, most of all, kindness. "You are stronger than you know," Mama Jolly told her. "And you will rise from this." For the first time in months, she felt warmth in her heart. She had a place to rest, a place where her child was safe. She was still broken, still tired, but she was not alone anymore. And that, in itself, was a miracle. With Mama Jolly's help, she learned to weave baskets and sell them at the marketplace. Her hands, once calloused from washing clothes, now moved with skill, crafting intricate patterns that caught the eye of buyers. She no longer begged. She no longer starved. And though the villagers still whispered, she did not bow her head in shame. She stood tall, her child strapped to her back, her hands full of the future she was building. She was not the broken girl they had scorned. She was a mother. A survivor. With Mama Jolly's help, she learned to weave baskets and sell them at the marketplace. Her hands, once calloused from washing clothes, now moved with skill, crafting intricate patterns that caught the eye of buyers. She no longer begged. She no longer starved. And though the villagers still whispered, she did not bow her head in shame. She stood tall, her child strapped to her back, her hands full of the future she was building. She was not the broken girl they had scorned. She was a mother. A survivor. She walked away that night without looking back. She no longer needed his love, his validation, his empty apologies. She had survived without him. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of his betrayal. And now, she would thrive. The village no longer laughed at her. They no longer whispered in pity. They saw her strength, her resilience. She had been broken, but she had healed. And as she kissed her child's forehead, she knew this was only the beginning. She walked away that night without looking back. She no longer needed his love, his validation, his empty apologies. She had survived without him. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of his betrayal. And now, she would thrive. The village no longer laughed at her. They no longer whispered in pity. They saw her strength, her resilience. She had been broken, but she had healed. And as she kissed her child's forehead, she knew this was only the beginning. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Let's spread strength and hope, one story at a time.